Good afternoon to you. 406 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up today, this hour, we'll talk to David Asher, a man who's been trying to dig in for some time, including when he worked in the Trump administration, into the origins of COVID. Brand new information on that front this week about the scientists who sought to cover it all up. Ben Klein will be with us as well, the congressman from Virginia, at 5:30. He was a part of the questioning today of FBI Director Christopher Wray. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Let me take you back in time now for this next examination of some of Christopher Wray's testimony today. It was October of 2021 that the United States Department of Justice under Joe Biden and Merrick Garland announced a series of plans to address what they referred to as violent threats against school officials and teachers nationwide. Attorney General Merrick Garland announcing in a press release here an increase in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school board members, teachers, and workers in our nation's public schools. The Attorney General directing the FBI and U.S. Attorney's offices to meet in the next 30 days with federal, state, tribal, territorial, and local law enforcement leaders to discuss strategies for addressing the disturbing trend. The sessions will open dedicated lines, full-time lines of communication for threat reporting, assessment, and response to school board meetings by law enforcement. And remember, Merrick Garland said, okay, now the FBI is opening up all of these very special lanes to track parents who attend these school board meetings nationwide. We're establishing a tip line. Threats can be reported to the public through the FBI's National Threat Operations Center. You can go online to fbi.gov to report on what these parents are up to. It was this full effort to criminalize parents showing up at school board meetings angry at the way that their kids were being treated, angry at the lies that they were being told, angry at the deception of what was going on inside the schools, the things that weren't being told to the parents, angry at the decisions, the curriculum decisions that were being made, anger at the issues around safety with their kids. These were all very real concerns that really led to real parents expressing their anger and their contempt and their concern and their worry at school board meetings nationwide, including right here in our area. We now know in retrospect how this all came to be, how this Merrick Garland decision came to be. And the answer is that the National School Board Association, working in concert with the Biden White House, came up with a false rationale for treating parents as extremists. That's the real story. White House officials asking the National School Board Association to bolster their claims as they started sending out this letter requesting the criminalization of parents. They said, well, give us more examples. So what kind of examples did they include? They included Scott Smith, a father whose daughter was sexually assaulted in Loudoun County. They turned him into a domestic extremist, a man who was doing nothing but voicing his horror at what had happened to his daughter in that school system. They turned him into a criminal. And then the forces of the United States, the power of the United States, turned against parents like him, who had already been victimized by school systems. They were now being victimized by the federal government. That's the truth. That's how it all came to pass. What that also led to, by the way, once the details on all of this came out, that led to an exodus of state school board associations saying, we don't want to associate with this National School Board Association anymore at all. Today, there was a very important line of questioning on this subject with Christopher Wray. Congressman Kevin Kiley, he may be unfamiliar to you, Republican. He had a series of questions today for Christopher Wray about this, and he starts off by emphasizing, we now know that there was no justification for this. So explain yourself. Explain Attorney General Garland's decision-making here. And listen as Christopher Wray begins to run away from the Attorney General of the United States in his decision-making, his horrific, tyrannical decision-making in this case.
This committee's investigation concluded that the Justice Department's own documents demonstrate that there was no compelling nationwide law enforcement justification for the Attorney General's directive. Do you have any reason to dispute that conclusion?
No.
Whoa. There was no good reason for the Attorney General to do that. Do you dispute that finding? That's the FBI director saying, no, I don't. That's interesting. And that's him, in one sense, running for cover. But it may also be an indication of the internal panic going on. As the FBI is told, you will treat parents as extremists.
So we had an investigation of parents. We had a sweeping mobilization of federal power against the most protected core First Amendment activity, the right of citizens to speak and petition their government on the most important of issues, the education of their children. And you are telling me that the entire basis for that, there was no evidence to support it.
Well, I want to be clear. We, the FBI, as I said, were not and did not investigate people for exercising.
Should Attorney General Garland rescind the memo?
I'm sorry?
Should Attorney General Garland rescind that memo?
Oh, that's a question for the Attorney General.
Do you believe he should?
Again, that's a question for the Attorney General.
Wow, okay. So now it's, hey, that memo, that garbage, should it be rescinded? He doesn't even want to answer it. He says, you should ask him. Ask Garland. Leave me out of this. Ask Garland. Do you believe it should be rescinded? Ask Garland. That's his job. Ask the Attorney General. Don't involve me anymore in this. I'm telling you. He goes on, should the Attorney General apologize to parents for this?
Do you believe that the Attorney General should apologize to parents who are the subject of that memorandum?
I'm not going to speak to that.
Will you apologize for the FBI's own role?
I think the FBI conducted itself the way it should here, which is that we've continued to follow our longstanding rules and have not changed anything in response to that memo.
Interesting. All right, so then there's another piece of this. So Kevin Kiley, Congressman Kiley, asks Chris Wray whether or not he was ever consulted when this memo was generated, when this guidance was generated. Who came up with this? Did they talk to you? Because now you're acting right now like, hey, look, just ask the Attorney General. We have nothing to do with it. Really? Were you consulted at any point during this process?
The FBI opened 25 assessments against parents and even created a new threat tag. Director Wray, did Attorney General Garland consult with you or the FBI before issuing that memorandum?
I can't get into discussions that did or maybe more importantly did not happen between the FBI and the department in advance of the...
Why do you say more importantly did not?
This is look what's happening. How hard is it to read between the lines here? This is not double spaced. This is quadruple spaced. He's saying blame Garland. That's what when he says I can't get into discussions that happened or more importantly did not happen. Wink, wink. He's saying Garland screwed the pooch and I want nothing to do with this disaster. That's what the FBI director is telling you today. More importantly, conversations that did not happen.
Issuing that memorandum.
I can't get into discussions that did or maybe more importantly did not happen between the FBI and the department in advance of the...
Why do you say more importantly did not?
Well, because I will say to you the same thing that I said to all 56 of our field offices as soon as I read the memo, which is that the FBI is not in the business of investigating or policing speech at school board meetings or anywhere else for that matter, and we're not going to start now. Now, violence... Threats of violence, that's a different matter.
Okay, all right. That's fascinating, too. So you just heard it from the FBI director. What happened? What was the sequence of events? He claims now, in so many words, he's implying that nobody asked him about this. Nobody asked him. Nobody checked in with him. AG Garland comes flying in and says the FBI is going to treat parents as terrorists. He goes on to say after he got that memo, he contacted all 56 of his field offices to let them know, no, we are not criminalizing speech. Why would you feel compelled to do that? Why would you need to contact the 56 field offices to let them know to abide by the Constitution? Why would that even be a conversation? Wouldn't they know? Didn't they take an oath? Why does the FBI director need to come in and say, hey, in this case, let's follow the Constitution? Why would that happen? Now, in case that version of events washed over you, or washed over if you saw it earlier. It happened again because Congresswoman Laurel Lee, also a Republican, goes back to this issue later in the hearing today with Christopher Wray. And he reiterates the point. But just, again, the special emphasis here. Garland sends out the memo. Wray is saying, I needed to contact the entire FBI after that memo went out to tell them, please don't investigate speech. Please, 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 don't investigate the parents for using their free speech rights. I was defending free speech, says Christopher Wray. Never mind the fact that his FBI has been urging social media companies to take down all sorts of content. What do you mean defending free speech? But in this case, I contacted these 56 offices and I said, you defend the free speech rights of these parents.
And I will say to you the same thing I said to all 56 of our field offices as soon as I read that memo.
As soon as the memo came out.
Which is the FBI is not and has never been in the business of policing or investigating speech by parents at school board meetings, and we're not about to start now.
I got to say, here's one of the things that really frustrates me. And I know it's all these lawmakers have limited time. They all have limited time. There's only so many things you can get out. And also, they write down their questions given the limited time that they have. So what often happens, and this happens for everybody, what often happens is you get so wrapped around your own axle thinking about what your next question is going to be. Sometimes you don't ask the necessary follow-up. You heard it from a moment ago from Congressman Kevin Kiley. He did a good job because when Chris Wray says, more importantly, the conversations that weren't had, Kiley heard it and said, wait a second, what do you mean, more importantly, the conversations that weren't had? That's an appropriate follow-up here. What killed me today was that nobody said, wait a second, why did you feel compelled to contact your 56 field offices and tell them not to violate the rights of these parents? Why was that so important to you? Why did this memo induce that action out of you? Nobody asked the follow-up on this, unfortunately. And I wish they did. Here's more from the answer from Wray.
Or investigating speech by parents at school board meetings, and we're not about to start now. We're going to keep doing what we've been doing, and that includes when there's violence, threats of violence, we're going to work with our state and local partners, as we always have on that, and following our normal procedures and our normal investigative steps and our normal standards for predication.
So, look, in so many words, what we're hearing from Christopher Wray today is that Attorney General Merrick Garland is an out-of-control tyrant. That's the summary from that. That is what he's alleging here. He's saying, I had nothing to do with this. We should have never been in this business in the first place. Nobody consulted me. And the second this memo came out, I said, do not trample the free speech rights of these parents. I went so far as to contact all 56 of my offices, my field offices. I think that's fascinating. I think that's totally fascinating. And my suspicion, I haven't seen a lot of headlines on this subject today. Am I wrong about this, Corey? I feel like I haven't seen anybody concentrate on this aspect of the hearing today, but I think this is very important. Wray is clearly sprinting away from the Attorney General of the United States. And so it turns out we got another scandal on our hands. It's 419. The caller points out that there are videos on the internet. That's true. There are videos on the internet. Continue, Vince. That include credible information of the FBI spying on school board meetings. So Christopher Wray and I told them not to do this, and then everyone's doing it? What? Here's FBI whistleblower Stephen Friend in testimony earlier this year talking to Matt Gaetz in a oversight hearing, in the Weaponization Committee hearing. And he had this to say about, surveilling parents at school board meetings.
Targeted. Mr. Friend, you ever been to a school board meeting?
Yes, I have.
FBI ever sent you to the parking lot of a school board meeting?
Yes, they have.
And in the parking lot of a school board meeting where the FBI sent you, you were taking down information regarding people's license plates.
That's correct.
Now, it wasn't the first time you'd been to a school board meeting, was it?
No, I went on my own as a private citizen.
As a parent?
Yes.
And so there you were. It must have been quite an interesting perspective. There you were taking down the information of parents attending school board meetings on behest of the FBI, and you had been one of those parents at a school board meeting. How did that feel?
Well, after I attended privately, my colleagues teased me that they were probably going to start investigating me.
You used to go after the worst of the worst, didn't you?
Yes, I believe so.
You went after people who looked at child porn?
Yes.
People who were sexually exploiting children?
Yes.
And then you were in the parking lot of a school board meeting, taking down the information of parents. What happened to the cases that you were working to protect our communities from the worst predators that exist?
I was told they were not to be resourced, and then after I was suspended, they were handed off to local law enforcement.
Wow, so the FBI just decided it was more important to have you in that parking lot of that school board meeting than getting the worst of the worst away from people that they could harm.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's okay. So there you go. So what more evidence do you need? So now you have Christopher Wray sitting in front of Congress today going, I told all these field offices, don't send any FBI agents after these parents. Stephen Friend saying I was assigned to a parking lot at a school board meeting, and I was tasked with writing down license plate numbers. This is amazing, isn't it? Let's take a phone call. Justin is in Wilmington, North Carolina now. Line 1, Justin, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show. Hello, sir.
Hey, good afternoon. Just some basic reading between the lines. And I worked as a bail bondsman for over 12 years, also qualifying bail bonds, talking to, people who were accused and co-signers, and it teaches you how to be a human lie detector. About Christopher Wray, when he says, I don't know means it's a red flag. It usually means I don't want to tell you. And when you're under oath and you do know, but then you say, I don't know, is that a lie?
Well, yeah, especially if there's a paper trail that shows you absolutely knew, that you talked at length about it, which is why sometimes I think a lot of these guys, they try not to have paper trails at all in order to avoid that very problem. But interesting take, Justin, and I agree with you. That's kind of the safe harbor for the person who doesn't want to tell you that they actually do know. I don't know. The Sergeant Schultz routine. I know nothing. Coming up, David Asher knows a lot about the origins of COVID. He's been digging in for years. He did it on behalf of the Trump administration. And now there's brand new information that shows that yet more corruption was going on in our government and with their closely associated scientists who were burying the whole thing. Good afternoon to you. 4:35 now, WMAL. Great to have you with us today. Coming up, Ben Cline, Congressman Ben Cline will be with us at 5:30. We will chat with him about his experience today, speaking with the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, what that was like trying to get some answers out of that guy. And you can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. A little update for you on what I was just sharing moments ago, that FBI agents were absolutely surveilling parents at school board meetings. Steve Friend, the FBI whistleblower, did tweet actually earlier today. He said the FBI director told the House Judiciary Committee that special agents did not conduct surveillance of school boards. He lied, Steve wrote. The Joint Terrorism Task Force in my office did it. I testified about the details in May, he said, and that's the audio you just heard. Again, this is a very live story. A lot of aspects of this developing as Christopher Wray testifies before Congress today. I'll get back to that coming up, but I want to move to a different area of concern with regards to the government. For some time, you and I have been very suspicious about the origins of the virus that the government used as a pretext to destroy so many lives. Where did COVID come from? Was it of natural origin, or did it leak from a U.S.-funded lab in Wuhan, China? This week, we get more information on the subject. The New York Post reports scientists who wrote the paper dismissing the so-called lab leak theory of the origin of COVID admitted they feared blaming China for accidentally releasing the virus, according to internal communications obtained by a House subcommittee. A co-author of the March 2020 Nature Medicine article, quote, "The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2," and other scientists who collaborated on the paper privately worried about the tshow, I'm censoring, that would happen if China in particular were deemed responsible for COVID escaping one of their research labs, according to the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. Given the bleep show that would happen if anyone serious accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say that given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape, so we are content with ascribing it to natural process, said Dr. Andrew Rambout, a professor of evolutionary biology at the University of Edinburgh. Wrote that in February of 2020. It was a Slack message to Dr. Christian Anderson, Dr. Edward Holmes, and Dr. Robert Gary, all top scientists in this field, all dedicated to covering up what actually is very likely the cause of COVID. For more on this, I want to turn to David Asher. He's our go-to on this subject. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, a former State Department COVID investigator under the Trump administration. David, great to have you back with us, sir.
Thanks very much. As always.
These are private messages that are being made public for the first time. What do they reveal to you?
Well, it reveals exactly what you just said, that it would be some show, as they said, if it came out, not just what China's role was, but really the role of American biologists in biology under Dr. Fauci's lead in transferring the technology, the know-how, money to the Chinese to conduct this type of dangerous research, so-called gain-of-function research, that most likely led to the creation of COVID-19. It goes beyond just the blowback against the U.S. government and its involvement. It's the fear that Ron Faucier, who's the crazy mad scientist over in Europe who adopted the H1N5 influenza variant, as I recall, made it super infectious through a crazy experiment, was then published with Fauci's permission. He says that the whole thing could, if we raise the issue of potential unnatural origin, i.e. a lab accident, it would do unnecessary harm to science in general and science in China in particular. Let's not forget Fauci said, I'd rather have the experiments going on in Wuhan than Hoboken, New Jersey. I mean, the whole idea is that we outsource some of our most dangerous research to the Chinese. And moreover, now that even the Director of National Intelligence, in a terrible report that it did, that was supposed to declassify information, did admit that the Chinese military was directly receiving funding from the U.S. government to do this exact research. And it was a Chinese military program, as I've told you in the past, that was highly classified. And it was classified for a reason, because it was offensive in orientation. It wasn't defensive. They weren't just creating advanced coronavirus as whether it was a bioweapon or not. They were created as a capability that eventually could be used as a type of biological warfare agent.
Yeah, they were stockpiling a biological warfare agent.
They were creating an ability to create chaos in the world economy in the event of a Taiwan scenario, I believe. And of course, when it leaked out accidentally, it did create chaos in the world economy and kill 20 million people. Can
I ask you just a question that you've just provoked me in my mind about this, and it's definitely a tangent. But one of the things, I know China reported basically no deaths due to COVID for most of the time that we were all locked down. And the claim was that the Chinese were making was, one, that those are authentic numbers, and I always thought that was a lie. But two, that it proves that their communist system is much more effective than our capitalist system, and therefore they're better. That was kind of the claim. But I've always wondered, what if there was some authenticity to those numbers, in the sense that maybe fewer Chinese people died because the virus was tailored to avoid that outcome? Well, we looked at that, the so-called genetically selected agent, and this has been something the Chinese had actually talked about publicly. We couldn't find in our analysis conducted, when I say our, it was State Department directed, but the work was done by Fort Detrick, the Army Biodefense Command, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. I mean, real scientists, okay? Yeah. I mean, we have scientists at state, but not, these are world-class biologists, DIA's National Center for Medical Intelligence. These are the people that know the most about biological agents. We just couldn't find evidence of it. But we do know the Chinese had that aspiration. But what they were trying to do initially was just to create a potential pandemic pathogen, COVID-19, that, if released, would bring the world to a halt and kill tens of millions of people, and would be stealthy and hard to attribute, which is exactly what came out in the hearing yesterday. I mean, it's interesting in these Slack messages, which is this messaging app that people use when they're putting together scientific papers and reports and research in corporate business communities everywhere, is the amount of conspiratorial activity among these scientists to consciously, even though they believed that it was 75-25 bioengineered, i.e. created in a lab, and most likely leaked from a lab, they rewrote their entire argument. And you can see it in the transcriptions of these messages among them.
to tailor to Fauci's sort of request, in effect, and Francis Collins, who remains the president's top science advisor, to steer the argument away from a potential, biomedical origin of it,
Yes.
because that would hurt their business. NIH has spent $38.5 billion, I told you before, in biodefense under Fauci's lead since 2002. It didn't detect, disrupt, defend anything.
So that remark that you brought up a moment ago, that Fauci said we'd rather be doing this kind of research in Wuhan rather than Hoboken, New Jersey, that is a sign of how dangerous this is. I mean, in other words, what he's saying is the probability of a leak is non-zero, and therefore we would rather do this somewhere where we don't care as much about the population dying. But that's a pretty obvious statement from Fauci that this is very dangerous research.
Yeah, I mean, of course. And we had banned this type of research in the United States, and we'd let it continue in China for whatever bizarre reason. Some of it was being continued actually against NIH's decree, but they never enforced anything. They didn't even know what the Wuhan Institute was. I mean, this is the thing, that there was no counterintelligence. There was no analysis at HHS, which controls NIH, which is the biggest federal agency, into the risk associated with this research. It was all about, well, let's let the Chinese die if there's an accident or something. I mean, like, the whole thing was ridiculous.
Yeah.
I don't think the Chinese did this on purpose, but when it accidentally leaked, they absolutely covered up. And what's amazing in these transcripts I wish the Congress had spent a lot more time, especially the Republicans, focusing on, rather than asking all these sort of random questions and points they were making in this hearing yesterday, because they could have really slammed these guys for having had a conspiracy to cover up, which is a federal crime.
So what happened?
Using federal money to do it.
Yeah. So what happens here is all of these scientists get together and collude to suppress a very legitimate theory into the origins of COVID, is that came from the lab in Wuhan. And even after they started writing their first draft of the scientific paper that was eventually used as a basis for worldwide censorship of this conversation, all the social media companies were adhering to this. They said, okay, we got to censor it. These scientists say there's no way it leaked from a lab. These very scientists behind the scenes, after they had even written the first draft of this, quote, proximal origins paper, you have Christian Anderson, who is one of the top guys here. He says, quote, the main issue is that accidental escape is in fact highly likely, he says in the transcript. It's not some fringe theory. That's funny because he signed on to, once this all went public, they made it seem like it was a very fringe theory. That's not what he was saying behind the scenes.
And he said yesterday that I changed my view because of new evidence. But no one has any new evidence. If you look at his Slack messages, there's no new evidence. They changed their view because they decided it would be politically unacceptable for them to put out anything that would blame China. Scripps Institute was bailed out, I think, in 2018 by the Chinese government through a huge donation. That's where Anderson and Andrew Rambout, his colleague, is. Rambout refused to testify yesterday because he didn't want to incriminate himself. He's also a British citizen, but I think he's dual. I mean, this thing stinks to high heaven.
Yes.
But and of course, we've got 1 million dead Americans and counting, and no answers. And this just gets at the fact that they also admitted yesterday, these two experts, that they had consulted both with the FBI, which is in the news today, and for the CIA on their assessments, which is, at least the FBI came out with an assessment that ascribed the most likely origin as a lab leak, but the rest of the intelligence community hasn't, except for Department of Energy. So this is the biggest cover up in the history of the U.S. government. Really, It makes Watergate and everything look like nothing. And what I'm afraid is blame is getting shifted further and further away from the Chinese.
Yes.
And the Chinese are essentially sitting there in Beijing like, we can get away with mass murder, and there's no hell to pay. I think it's a major problem.
It also, these messages also highlighted, at least for me, the word games that Anthony Fauci was playing every time he testified before Congress. Rand Paul would constantly confront him about what we refer to as gain-of-function research, which makes these viruses more lethal and infectious to humans. And Fauci would continuously insist that there's no evidence that the virus was genetically modified or engineered in order to suggest that it was of natural origins. But in the chats here, in these messages that I'm reading now that are just being made public, they talk about something called passaging, which is a way to sort of force a virus to mutate while still leaving the virus looking natural. Isn't that the right thing?
Yeah, you inject like a bat a virus into a rhesus monkey, which has a lot of high degree of genetic similarity with a human being, and you then go back and forth, cycling it back and forth, and you can bring in these strange animals like pangolins, which have a very high receptor binder affinity to the COVID-19 receptor binder, which is crazy because how did that, as John Stewart said, how did the pangolin, this anteater like thing, mate with the bat? Well, they didn't. Their blood was transfused among each other, essentially injected between each other and other types of fluids,
right,
in order to create a convolution, an artificial evolution. That's what they do in these experiments. But this is exactly what the Chinese had publicly said they were working on with the support of the National Institutes of Health. And, unfortunately, other government agencies as well. No one seemed to think that that might be related to China's biological weapons program, which it most definitely is. I mean, when the DNI, the intelligence directorate, came out and said it was the military that was part of this whole thing, well, what they really meant, it was the Chinese biological weapons program that was part of it, and they just don't want to. They say this wasn't a biological weapon, I guess, because it wasn't in some canister and dumped on top of New York City or something. It had the same effect. It was dumped all over the entire world. I mean, so, again, what we've got is a situation of a cover-up. I will say, and I'll send you a document in a second that you might want to post. The DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency's, the National Center for Medical Intelligence, which is the absolute premier agency in charge of analyzing biological threats for the U.S. Defense Department, has an unclassified analysis that was entered into the congressional record yesterday at this hearing that in 6 pages demolishes this so-called proximal origins paper, these academics saying that this thing came out of a natural host. And it takes the same information and reverses it. And these are the absolute experts in the U.S. Military on biological agents. And their analysis is this 100% was a synthesized, biosynthesized creation, a Frankenstein's monster that was, one way or another let loose by the Chinese. And the sequence itself shows that this is not natural. And therefore, that is the most powerful piece of unclassified information that's available. Unfortunately, the other information was supposed to be unclassified. All the stuff I worked on, that was supposed to be declassified. It's still classified, so I can't talk about it. But this is one document that gets at what we were looking at, at the level of the Secretary of State on down, and the Secretary of Defense. And I'll make sure you have it to post. It's 6 pages long. People can read it. Very well written.
That sounds very fascinating. And so David Asher, this document, this unclassified DIA document, was this a document that was put together by the current administration, or was it?
No, it was put together during the. It was in I believe it was put together in April of 2020, issued in May, and it went to all the. It not only there was a classified version of it too, but the unclassified version tells you all you need to know. And it basically is a rejection of this proximal origins paper that these guys testified about yesterday as being so above holier than thou, et cetera. It basically trashes it, and it's done by a scientist named Commander Jean-Paul Chrétien, who is not just a Navy commander. He has a PhD and MD in genetics, genetic science from Johns Hopkins. The guy's like literally the U.S. government expert on this area, and he worked at Fort Detrick, where the experiments are actually conducted to try to simulate these types of things. So whether he was involved in those experiments to try to duplicate the conditions of SARS, COVID-19 or not, he has absolute domain expertise. He makes these professors look like chumps, and Fauci too. And he just demolishes them. And this was an analysis that went up to the president. It went to the Secretary of State. And it resonated with lots of stuff that we know from other sources we can't talk about.
Yeah.
I'll just say that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when President Trump finally started saying in public that he suspected the lab leak and he couldn't really share much. I imagine he was informed by a lot of that at the time.
It was a lab leak of a bioengineered creation. This is a Frankenstein. This is not something that came out of a zoonotic host or a natural setting. It may have been introduced into a natural setting accidentally, but it most definitely, it was, as Dr. Redfield said, it was optimized to spread from day one. There's no naturally occurring virus that just mutates like that in a period of days and suddenly can kill half humanity. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. David Asher, thank you very much for staying on top of this topic and sharing your information with us as we get it.
Thanks for staying on top of this. I'll send you that document.
Thank you. Please do. We'll post. Okay, coming up, we're going to get into the details of what the White House is doing to destroy the life of a reporter who's actually trying to ask real questions. Amazing breaking news now. I'll share it with you coming up and his reaction as well. Also, we've got a congressman joining us. Ben Klein will be here. We'll talk to him about his interrogation of Christopher Wray today. All ahead.